Hi everyone, my name is Toro Macias and I will be analyzing Robert Frost's poem Range Finding. I'm gonna read the poem to you so you will have a background on what I'm analyzing. The battle rent a cobweb diamond strung and cut a flower beside a ground bird's nest. Before it stained a single human breast, the stricken flower bent double and so hung. And still the bird revisited her young. A butterfly its fall had dispossessed, a moment sought in air his flower of rest, then lightly stooped to it and fluttering clung. On the bare upland pasture their hearts spread, overnight twixt mullein stalks a wheel of thread, and straining cables wet with silver dew, a sudden passing bullet shook it dry. The indwelling spider ran to greet the fly, but finding nothing, sullenly withdrew. This poem the context of this poem was that it was written during World War I by Robert Frost, and it talks mainly about a battlefield. More specifically, it talks about how a bullet passes through nature and through the trenches before it reaches a human. And the poem talks about how it affects nature and how war of men affects nature as a whole. For example, in the first stanza, which is 8 lines and following the sequence A, B, B, A, B, B, A, the soldier fires the bullet in the very first line. The battle rent a cobweb diamond strung. Then the second line, and cut a flower beside a ground bird's nest. This means that the bullet has cut the flower and it has affected the flower. Now, it not only it affects humans, but it affects nature, and everything the bullet touches, everything the bullet passes through is affected. The stricken flower bent double and so hung. This makes more emphasis on the fact that nature is affected, because bent double and so hung means it died. The flower was affected by the bullet cut the flower in half. And the next line is, and still the bird revisited her young. This means that despite the horrifying the horror of war and all the still, nature manages to find a way. The bird revisited her young. This means that the bird is still working, it's still caring for their young, and war won't change that. Just it affects nature, but despite what's going on between men, nature will continue to prevail. The next line is, a butterfly its fall had dispossessed. Then this means that the bullet is also affecting a butterfly. It makes more emphasis on the fact that nature is affected, and its fall had dispossessed, meaning its fluttering of wings had stopped. Then the butterfly was maybe hit by the bullet, or the bullet passed really close to it, and therefore caused a ripple in the air around it, and the butterfly was deeply disturbed. A moment sought in air his flower of rest. This means that the butterfly stopped and was paralyzed for a second, then lightly stooped to it and fluttering clung. This means that the butterfly landed and still, but wasn't dead. So nature is affected, but it will continue to live despite what men do to each other. There's a change in stanza, And we move on to the next verse, which is 6 lines. It starts with, "On the bare upland pasture there had spread." This represents peace, delicacy, and the focus in the stanza is on the butterfly, the detail and the monstrous events in the background that are contrasted to the beauty of the butterfly. Then the next line talks about the spider. "Overnight, twixt mullein stalks a wheel of thread," meaning that the spider is working on its cobweb, and straining cables wet with silver dew. Here there is intricate detail, and it shows us how the spider was building its web. Maybe overnight it got wet because of the dew, and this is a feeling of peace and of nature being completely pure. And then the line changes to a much more violent tone. "A sudden passing bullet shook it dry." This is like impacting. This is a show of violence to the spider and disturbing the peace of nature. "Shook it dry." The word "shook" makes more emphasis on the violence. Not did it just pass and vibrated, it shook it and it disturbed completely the spider. Then the next line explains how the spider, when the cobweb shakes, it thinks that it has caught a fly. So the indwelling spider ran to greet the fly, but finding nothing, sullenly withdrew. This means that there is major disappointment in war, and mostly no good can come of it, as only false hopes made by the spider as well as humans can come from conflict. It's interesting how Frost talks about this bullet in the First World War and how it affects the nature, and focuses on nature's response to the war of men, and how men are not really aware of how they have a big impact on nature. The meaning of this poem is that there are a lot of tiny details that men doesn't realize, and humankind doesn't visualize the impact they have on nature while destroying themselves. Not only wars are basically made of destruction, and while we destroy each other, we also destroy our planet. And Frost really wanted to make this clear to the audience. Frost makes us sympathize for the spider, the flower, and the butterfly. It gives us details, and it gives us their point of view, and it contrasts to us because we don't usually, as humankind doesn't usually visualize others' point of view. We are very selfish, and by making wars, we only see our point of view, not anybody else's, which makes us, therefore, really selfish. At first, this poem was kind of difficult to understand, but then I researched the meaning of range finding, and we found that the meaning was that during World War I, there were huge cannons that threw the ball, and that threw bullets, and they counted the seconds until they heard the bullet touch the ground. Therefore, they could calculate how far the enemy was. So, and that's called range finding, and the fact that Robert Frost has named this poem after it is what gives meaning to the poem. If Robert Frost had named this poem anything else, maybe it would be a little harder to understand. But then again, there are many representations of what this poem could represent. For example, range finding also represents could also be interpreted as maybe finding the range of what humans will do to destroy each other. Maybe about finding our limits and what we will do to push those limits. But then again, there are many interpretations of what the title could mean. But all in all, this poem makes a lot of sense once it's analyzed, and I think it's a really interesting poem because it can be interpreted in lots of different ways, and I think it gives us a perspective of nature that we mostly oversee. And I think this is a great poem. Thank you.